Today we're going to take a look at 3 of the best portrait lenses Canon's RF mount currently has to offer. This includes the 85mm 1.2 and the 70-200mm 2.8, with this zoomed out all the way to 200mm at both f2.8 and f4. I'm also going to throw the 50mm 1.2 into the mix, which is my personal favourite. We're going to compare things like background blur, background compression, the overall rendering of each lens, and we'll also take a quick look at the working distance of each focal length. So let's get straight into it. So let's start with the 50mm 1.2. You can see here the working distance of 50mm for a headshot typically puts you around 1 meter away from your subject. And despite being this close, however, we're still capturing quite a bit of the background in the image, so we can still see the sky and we can see the trees in the distance. I'm also going to show some close-up crops of each image, but in terms of sharpness, all 3 of these lenses excel to the point where it's really not worth worrying about. Now onto our mid-length shot, which puts me around about 2 meters away from the model, which is still easily close enough to communicate. I love the 50mm for a mid-length shot like this because it just retains so much of the environment in the image, and this lens in particular, I love the rendering and it gives you this almost 3D pop to your images. Now looking at a full-length shot, you can see I'm only really taking a few steps back here and can easily capture a full body shot while still being close enough to communicate comfortably. Something I always like to do is try and show models images on the back of the camera whenever possible. And the good thing about 50mm is it keeps you close enough to be able to do that. And again, on this full length shot, I love the rendering, still getting that 3D pop. The bokeh is smooth, but we're still getting plenty of context in the image and in the background. So here's our set of 3 images on the 50mm lens. Now, moving on to the 85mm 1.2, I noticed my positioning here for a headshot with the 85 was roughly the same as the 50mm for a mid-length crop. So here's our headshot. We're losing a little bit of the environment now, like we can no longer see the sky, for example, but we're getting such a nice smooth focus fall off on the face with a slightly more flattering rendering too. Now onto a mid-length shot, and we're stood around 4 meters away now from our subject, which roughly about the same distance as the 50mm lens when shooting a full body shot. So this looks great. We're starting to see some more background compression here with the trees feeling a lot closer to the subject than it did in the 50mm shots. And onto full length for the 85, and unfortunately I messed up when recording this. I just had the camera set up on a tripod and I really thought I'd be in frame here, but I'm not. I'm about 1 meter to the left off camera, so you're having to back up a considerable amount at this point to get a full body shot at 85, but it really is worth it when you see the images. I've started using 85 more and more for full body shots. I really love like the background separation you're getting on a shot like this, and I keep using the term 3D pop, but I really think that sums up the rendering of both these prime lenses. So here's our 3 85mm shots. And now moving on to the 70-200, shooting at 200mm. Here's the distance to subject we're looking at here for a headshot. Still close enough to communicate with your subject. This is actually a lens I really struggled to gel with. I've owned it for around a year and I barely used it for portraiture. But I was so surprised by just how much more flattering this lens is for headshots at 200mm compared to the primes. I'm usually always grabbing an 85 for a shot like this, but the rendering here is so good. We've lost the majority of the background here, and this lens is so good at this focal length in particular, just isolating a subject. I've included some f4 shots so you can see the difference between 2.8 and f4 here. For a mid-length shot, we're having to back up a considerable amount now, and this is something you really do have to consider if you're planning on using this lens at 200mm. You're going to need plenty of room to be able to shoot anything more than a headshot. It's also starting to put you far enough away from your model where you can't actually communicate and feedback or show images easily. So if that's a concern, it's worth bearing in mind. The images are great though. I did notice that my lens seems to render a little cooler than the primes, which is obviously easily fixed in post, but I'd be interested to know if any of you guys have experienced something similar. Very subtle difference between the 2.8 and f4 images, but you can see, particularly in the trees to the left of the model, just a slightly busier background, but in the real world I'm not sure I'd care. Again, apologies for messing this shot up. I backed the camera way up, but it still wasn't enough, and I'm about 2 meters to the left of the frame. So at this point, we're too far to communicate effectively when working at 200mm, and you're going to need a ton of room for a shot like this. We see the same difference in the background rendering between the 2.8 and f4 images, with the f4 images being just a little bit less smooth, which is to be expected. And here's our 200mm shots at both f2.8 and f4. So let's compare each of these lenses at each crop. Now we've established that the 2.8 and f4 images at 200mm are so similar, I'm just going to include the f2.8 results here. Here's our headshots, which I think show the biggest difference in how the face is rendered, and 200mm is by far the most flattering and definitely my favourite of these three. This close at 50mm facial features tend to be a little exaggerated due to perspective distortion when using a wider lens up close, looking at the nose for example. But in terms of background blur, I think at this crop they're very similar, with maybe the 85 being the nicest. And onto our mid-length shot, 50mm is my favourite here. It's all personal preference, of course, but I just like to capture a little bit more of the environment in a shot like this. The 85 definitely probably has the smoothest background, and at this crop we're seeing the biggest differences in background compression here. And on our full-length shots, without a doubt, 85mm is my favourite here. Tons of background separation, and we're still capturing just enough of the environment. These shots really do illustrate the difference in background compression too, with the 200mm giving the effect of bringing the background so much closer to the subject. But I want to know what you think. So, which is your favourite lens out of the three? And which one would you pick for each type of shot? Let me know down in the comments. My personal favourite is still the 50mm. Personal preference, of course, but I really like including a little bit more of the environment in my images. But I'm definitely going to be using that 200mm focal length more, especially for headshots, because it just looks so good. Very soon I'm going to be releasing a full-length review on each of the three lenses included in today's comparison. So if that's something you might be interested in, please consider subscribing so you can catch those as soon as they come out in the future. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.